Bisa lanjutkan dengan memperkenalkan pembicara kita hari ini. Silakan, Prof.
Baik, good afternoon and welcome to all participants who participated in the sharing session 8 on linguistics this afternoon, and especially to our resource person, Dr. Simon Musgrave and Professor Nick Thieberger. We would like to thank you very much for sharing your time among your tight schedule to share your expertise with us, the participants who attended the event this afternoon. But from the long pandemic we pass, it also gives good opportunity for us to know prominent linguists, though only virtually. The topic that will be discussed this afternoon is the language documentation quartet. To the participating ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the seminar. Hope you get new insight regarding the topics presented. For further introduction about our two resource person, I leave it to Mr. Dede. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Sedang, and I hope everyone can hear me. So let me take a minute to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Simon Musgrave, a lecturer at the Department of Linguistics and Applied Linguistics at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and his research covers various areas of linguistics and sociolinguistics that are linked by the themes of the use of computational tools in linguistic research and the relationship between linguistics and digital humanities. Simon also has experience in language documentation, especially in eastern part of Indonesia, Maluku, and today he will be presenting a joint work about language documentation and digital humanities, I would say, with Associate Professor Nick Thieberger from the University of Melbourne. And Nick is also the director of Paradisec, the well-known digital platforms for archiving digital sources in endangered cultures and languages of the world. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Simon to the session. And over to you, Simon. So go ahead for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Gede. And selamat siang, ibu bapak semua. Now it's better I switch back to English. Otherwise I'll confuse myself. I'm going to share my screen. Just 1 second. Okay, so the title of this talk is The Language Documentation Quartet, and I will explain exactly what Nick and I mean by that in a moment. First, I apologise that Nick can't be with us this afternoon, and due to the fact that he was on leave a couple of weeks ago, we didn't manage to get a photograph of him to put on the flyer that Gede distributed. So my first slide, I thought it's only fair that you get to see what Nick looks like, as well as the fact that you're going to look at me for the next little while. So as Gede said, this is joint research that Nick and I have been conducting for a number of years. So what are we interested in here? We're interested in the idea that language description is complex kind of information, and that using technological resources, we can make it more accessible and more useful. And what we have in mind specifically here is presenting this kind of material on the web, in a browser. The reason why this seems like such an attractive idea is that the nature of this kind of material is that it's all linked. There are many, many different kinds of links between different aspects of the material, which can be made easy to negotiate using hypertext and the resources of web technology. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, about whether this is feasible and what it actually looks like once you start trying to present the descriptive elements of language documentation in this way. What we're talking about is the kind of links that we're going to have between the words that appear in texts, which are part of your documentation, and the words that appear in a dictionary, which you produce as the result of the documentation. The kind of links you want to have between the examples that you use to support points in your grammatical description and the context in which they occur, the rich contextual environment where you drew that example, which you can't reproduce entirely in a grammar. You can only give maybe a single example sentence, but it may be important information for the reader to understand fully what you're doing. We can link these things using web technology. We can link between a text and media, a sound file or a video file showing or presenting the actual linguistic event. This is easy to do with modern technology. You can't do it in a book. So these are the kinds of aims that we have here to try and make all this material interlinked and easily accessible. The way also that we want this to work is that there's going to be relatively simple paths from some moderately standardized kinds of data formats, at least well-defined data formats. Even if not everybody is using exactly the same formats, they should be using formats that are clearly defined so that it's not too difficult to transfer between them. And what we want to do is to say, if you have, say, your dictionary data and your text data in some kind of format that we understand, then it should be straightforward to get to this richly interlinked presentation fairly automatically. It shouldn't be something that takes a lot of manual effort. It should be more or less a question of plugging files in at one end and having web files come out at the other end, which you can immediately view. So that's what we're working towards. And the kind of formats we have in mind, we wouldn't want to limit them to being the basis for one kind of presentation only. They should be able to be the basis for different kinds of presentation. And when we get to having a look at the kind of state of our work at the present time, I'll show you an example of that. Another aim that we have here, which is fairly specific to the material we're working with, but not irrelevant generally, is that this kind of presentation enables choice. You can present things in, as I've just said, they can have different modes of presentation, but within a single mode of presentation, you can allow the user to make choices about what they want to see. In particular, as I'll describe as we go through this, the material we're working with, there are two ways of writing the language down. There's the style that the linguist who wrote the description uses, and more recently, the community of speakers have developed an orthography, a spelling system of their own. For this present purpose, therefore, we're aiming to make it possible to view all of the material in both forms, and the user gets to choose. The user can say, I just want to see the practical orthography, or I want to see the orthography that the linguist used, and you can switch between them at any point. So this is the kind of possibility that is enabled by working in this way. We don't have to print two separate editions of the material. But we, sorry, I just responded to something on screen. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, we don't have to print two complete versions of the material. It exists, it's generated automatically, and the user can choose what they're going to work with. And now I can't move on my screen. Sorry, I shouldn't have approved that annotating. Can we stop that?
Okay, maybe stop sharing screen, Simon.
Yeah, go back in again. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Maybe someone tries to request annotation, but yeah, I think you can reshare again.
Yeah. Okay. So the questions I'm going to be looking at, or the questions that arise when in our project to try and achieve these aims, one important question is what kind of formats do we want to put our data into? And I'm not going to talk very much about that today. What I am going to talk about much more today is what are the pathways from that data to the web presentation, and what kind of targets for the various kinds of linking should we be worried about in this process? So when we think about what we want to link one thing to another, what are the targets, what are the sources, then that gives us a very clear indication of how the pathways are going to develop from our data formats to the final product. And that's what I'll mainly be concentrating on in this presentation. So in particular, looking at the question of what kind of stuff we need to encode in our data formats. What needs to be made explicit so that it can be the basis for further processing. So we're talking here about language description. And language description has been viewed as having a three-part structure for over 100 years now. So this is a view that's generally attributed to at least starting with Franz Boas in the early decades of the 20th century. And the three parts, which are texts, dictionary, description, are nevertheless, although we think of them separately, they're closely linked conceptually. So we would expect that forms in texts, words or morphemes, are going to appear in the lexicon, in the dictionary. We assume that there's going to be a correspondence between those. Maybe not complete, but to a large extent. We assume that the entries in the dictionary, the lexicon, will want to support them, to illustrate them using examples, and those examples will come from the texts. So they're linked as well, and the kind of descriptive points that are made in the grammar proper, again, we'll want to support them with examples. We'll want to illustrate how the structure of the language actually works, and again, we're going to want to use, ideally, examples from the texts. So the three things are separate but interlinked. As Boas said, over 100 years ago, there was very little systematic work. People collected word lists, vocabularies, but there were not many grammars around. Most of the ones he was aware of, he was talking then at this stage about the situation in North America, where he did most of his linguistic work. There were grammars that had been written by missionaries maybe hundreds of years ago. And he said even when there were grammars, there were no texts. And more, he says, it's evident that large masses of text are needed to elucidate the structure of languages, both in terms of the analytic procedures, but also in terms of what you want to present. And we can see this viewpoint even 100 years ago as underlying what has become documentary linguistics in the last 25 years. The idea that having large bodies of evidence is basic to what we want to do. That's a step that should come before description, assembling a documentary collection. Now, the kinds of links that I've just been talking about between the different parts of grammatical description and language documentation, these are quite hard to manage in print. But as I've already suggested, they're easy to manage in hypertext. So there's big advantages in trying to make everything available in that way. Now, Boas talked about 3 parts in the description: the texts, the grammar, the dictionary or lexicon. But one of the huge technological advances that we've experienced over the last few decades is how easy and affordable it has become to work with multimedia. So when I started in linguistics, which was a little while back, the main way that we made recordings was on cassette tapes. Cassette tape technology is not that great, and we thought it was very good, but in fact it has disadvantages. The tapes deteriorate, it's not easy to copy them, it's not easy to distribute them, and so forth. Nowadays, of course, all that has changed. We have digital methods for recording audio and video. Copying is flawless, dissemination is easy. And all of this is really affordable nowadays. So this is a huge change in the way that people can work. And it means that the idea of describing a language now has 4 elements to it. It's gone from having the 3 parts to 4 parts. And we would expect nowadays that state-of-the-art work in language description will at least be giving us a way to access media without specialised resources. It should be a matter of using tools that everybody has on their devices. It may mean you have to go through an archive to get to materials, but once you're there, you should be able to handle this just with the regular media playing capabilities of whatever device you're on. Shouldn't take any special tools. So that's part of what we're also working on here. And this is why we're now talking about a quartet. There's the old Boasian trilogy, text collection, dictionary and grammar, plus media, making up 4 parts. If you're fussy about these things, there's been a kind of slippage in the metaphor here between trilogy, which is something in 3 parts, and quartet, which is 4 people working together. But, you know, it's not a big deal. It's a nice metaphor. Gede pointed out to me that maybe I was influenced in this by the fact that at one stage in my life I was a professional violinist, and I still think of the string quartet as a very wonderful way of communicating certain things, and maybe I'm influenced in that way to think of this as a quartet. 4 different strands working together to produce something greater than any of them is on their own. So that's the title of this talk, the Language Documentation Quartet. We're talking about these 4 elements: a collection of texts, a dictionary, a descriptive grammar, and the media, the original material recordings that all of this is based on. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the advantages of presenting this material as digital material, but let me just run through this again, make sure we're all comfortable with what these advantages are going to be. So we get this very easy possibility for including the primary data, audio and video. We can link to that. It's going to be in a digital format anyway. It's sitting on a server somewhere, and you can get to it and see it and listen to it and include that in how you experience this material. Digital presentation makes it much easier to actually navigate the material in the way that most people would anyway. I do know some people who sit down and read grammatical descriptions from start to finish, but most people, I think, in most situations do not do that. If they're interested in something in a language, they will read the sections of the grammar that are relevant. They'll look at text examples that are relevant. They don't want to read through from beginning to end necessarily. Digital presentation makes it much easier to do this kind of non-linear traversal of the material. You can move around from one area to another. You can skip bits, you can go back to them later, and so forth. So it makes it much easier to navigate in the ways that people actually genuinely use this material. The underlying formats we're talking about end up, we think, being more stable archival forms also. So this is, if you prepare the material in this way, you have the added benefit that you have something which is likely to persist into the future. It's more sustainable. The kind of, if you think just of what you might use as the basis for a printed presentation, that's going to be a word processor file. Word processor files are not necessarily going to survive. Even in major software packages like Office, Word, there's a limit to the backward compatibility. At some point, you just can't open old files anymore. And unless you've remembered to migrate everything on a regular basis, you may be in trouble. The kind of formats we're talking about using to store data are much more stable than that. They're much more accessible over time. So this is an advantage that comes as a kind of side benefit to the approach we're advocating. You also can note that printing, analog presentation, has some limitations. It doesn't allow various things easily. So checking, particularly things like checking consistency of references, this is very time consuming when you're looking at print. You can spend a lot of time doing it. When you have all this material in digital formats which are well defined, it's very easy to make these kind of consistency checks. Obviously, analog presentation doesn't allow you to link to media easily. You can print a source for each of your example sentences saying it came from this recording and it's at this time code, but someone still has to go and look for that. They're not just going to click on a link and get there. There's also the problem that because you're working with a presentation format in general for print, not a data-driven underlying format, when you edit things, you may have to change a whole lot of stuff. If you're working with more data-driven formats, that doesn't change. The way you want to present things may change, and that's a matter of the presentation. It's not a matter of the underlying material. So working in this way can reduce the amount of revision and editing that may need to be done along the way. So these are all advantages for trying to work in the way that we're advocating. Now, let me tell you about what we've actually been working on. We've been working on material written by an American linguist called Geoffrey Heath in the 1980s. Geoffrey Heath spent quite a lot of time working in Australia. He worked on more than one language, but most of his work was on a language called Ngubuyu, which is spoken in eastern Arnhem Land in the north of Australia. And he published 3 separate volumes documenting this language. So he produced a volume of texts first, then a dictionary, and then the grammar last. And you can see on the screen these 3 separate volumes. And what's quite unusual about this publication is that Heath makes explicit links between all of them in a way that is not normally done. And I'll explain how he did that in a second. He also has a limited amount of links. He has at least a list telling you which of his texts are on which of the texts he archived. So it is possible to actually trace back to original recordings in the case of Heath's texts. Time consuming, but you could do it. But as I said, he does make explicit links between these 3 volumes in a very interesting way. What he did was that he did not provide any actual examples in his grammar or in his dictionary. There are no example sentences in either of those volumes. What there is links to the text volume, references to individual lines in text examples. So in the dictionary, you'll get a word, you'll get some information, a definition, you'll get maybe some morphological derivatives, and then it'll say examples, and it'll say text 47, unit 4, line 3, text 51, unit 11, line 2, and so on. That's what you get. There are no actual examples printed on the page in the dictionary in front of you. You have to go and pick up the text volume and look at it. The same thing for the grammar. Sorry, I've done these in the opposite order to what's on. Example, easy example. This is what a possessive structure looks like. And then it'll example sentences, it'll say C text 151, unit 11, line 4, and so forth. Again, you have to go and pick up the text volume, find the right page, and check those examples. And Heath is consistent about this. There are no example sentences in the grammar or in the dictionary. Everything refers back to the texts. There are also some internal cross-references from one section to another. And there are occasional links from the dictionary to the grammar, but there's only a few of these. In some cases, a dictionary entry will say, see discussion in grammar or something like that. It's not very clear exactly where you have to go to find the relevant passage, but it does happen in a few places. But crucially, there's all these explicit references to examples from the grammar, from the dictionary. Instead of printing them in that volume, you have to go and look for them in the text volume. Now, Heath did this for good reasons, and he explains his reasons, and I think that they're interesting in that they relate to issues that are still current when we talk about scholarship in linguistics. One of the things he's concerned about is documentation. To what extent we want to be explicit about what we have as documentary evidence. And related to that, he's interested in accountability. Now, these are issues that are much discussed nowadays, probably less discussed in his time. I think he was ahead of his time, but now we're very interested in these questions. The entire kind of open access movement across science and humanities is based on the idea that we want accountable analyses. We want it to be possible for a person reading an analysis to say, well, I'm not sure if I believe that. Can I go back to the original evidence and check? Can I go and look at this for myself? And that implies then rich documentary records that are accessible and so forth. So these are questions that are still very current. And Heath was bringing them up in a way that other people probably weren't so concerned about in his day. But what he was doing didn't really match very well with the technological capabilities that were there in 1980, because everything was ink on paper. And that's just really hard to implement all this stuff. I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes from what he said about these questions, because I think it's interesting to see how he was thinking about them. But his thinking now seems prescient. It seems like he was thinking ahead of his time. The technology has changed in ways that mean we can implement his ideas much more effectively. And that's one of the things that this project is trying to do. So in terms of documentation, I'm not going to read right through this, but you can see that Heath says the cited examples have a documentary value. You know that the example comes from a real text. And if you want to reanalyze it, you can do it yourself. So he says that this achieves a far higher level of documentation than is observable in other reference grammars, where you just get individual sentences printed in the grammar. Because he's sending you back to look at the texts all the time, it's much more documented. It's much more information that you can use if you want to check his analysis. And in terms of accountability, he was very concerned then that everything did relate to the texts and that these were not just elicited material. These were more or less spontaneously produced. Everything he does is, all his texts are monologues, so it's not as rich a documentation as people might aim for today, but everything is spontaneous. It's people telling stories, telling traditional stories, telling myths, telling stories about their lives, and some procedural information there as well. And as he says, experience was that most published grammars are based on material obtained in unreliable direct elicitation sessions. And he didn't want to do that. He said he had no confidence in such data. So he wanted all of the information in his description to be of a particular kind, and he wanted to make that accountable. He wanted to make his procedures accountable so we could see that that was the case. So this is Heath's description of Nungabuyu, which was, and it was received as being unusual, certainly. So the reviews that were published in various learned journals tend to say, yes, this is a wonderful, important contribution, but also, oh my God, it's hard to use. A couple of examples of this: Barry Blake wrote a review in the Australian Journal of Linguistics, which he said, unfortunately, the functional grammar of Nungabuyu is a very demanding work. Partly because of the complexity of the language, but also because it requires the reader to make constant reference to the text volume. John Heyman reviewed it for language. He also said it was a major work, but said that one must look up the attestations for every major grammatical point in another volume. And this has been an ongoing reaction to Heath's work. He published his description under the title Functional Grammar of Nungabuyu. At least some of my colleagues who work on Australian languages have been heard to refer to it as the dysfunctional grammar of Nungabuyu because of these problems in actually negotiating the text. So part of our project is saying, well, Heath had these ideas, he was trying to do these things, the technology wasn't suitable for what he was doing, or at least makes it very hard for the user, but technology has changed. And what we can do today should make this all work very smoothly. So let's look at this in practice. What does it all mean? On the screen are some small chunks from each volume of Heath's work. A paragraph from the grammar at the top, a unit of text in the middle, and at the bottom an entry from the dictionary. And you can see in the paragraph from the grammar, there's all these numerical references, all these references to texts. So for example, it says you'll find an example illustrating a point here in text 43, unit 4, line 3. And there it is. So the section from the grammar is discussing the particle ngijang, and here's the example as it says in the grammar with preceding mari. But in Heath's presentation, these are two physical volumes. You have to move from one book to another book to make this link. Then you can see down in the entry from the dictionary, again, there's these numerical references saying these are examples of this word. One of them also is for text 43, in this case, unit 4 again, and in the first line. And there you can see the example given in that text for this word, banggid. Again, the dictionary is a separate physical volume from the texts. You have to move between one and the other to make this link. That's what Heath wanted to do. And as I've said several times now, with ink on paper, this is really hard to work with. The idea is wonderful, but the implementation with this technology is problematic. So how can we make it much easier to deal with this stuff? How can we use technology to make it work? Now I'm going to talk through the kind of links that actually we want to implement in our presentation. So there are links between forms, between morphemes and words. We've seen some ways that Heath made that explicit, particularly for entries in the dictionary giving examples of the words or the forms. What isn't there, but which we think should be, is links from forms in the grammar to the dictionary. So although Heath doesn't give actual example sentences in the grammar, of course he has to use forms. There are words and morphemes from Ngubuyu which appear in the dictionary, and they can be linked to the dictionary explicitly using hypertext. In the dictionary itself, there can be in any given entry, there can be mentions of other forms in the dictionary, synonyms, antonyms, related words, and so forth. Again, we can make links between them. We can make even richer linking environment than what Heath had in mind. And we can also make links from the forms in the texts to the dictionary. That's one reason, you have a dictionary, you're working through a text, you come to a form which you may want more information on, you're going to look it up in the dictionary. Using hypertext, we can make that a more or less automatic process. You click on a word and you go to the dictionary entry. So these are not made explicit by Heath, but they're implicit. We think in the way he was developing how language description worked. He'd already made it explicit that certain kinds of exemplification, you had to go and look at texts. These other kinds of links are implicitly there, and we want to realize them as well. Now, what's important here is all of this gets handled automatically. It's not a case of going through the 450 pages, I think, of texts and identifying each form that could be in the dictionary and manually writing a link. No, we can search for the forms and then we can provide the links automatically. In the case of the grammar, this is straightforward because Heath was fairly careful about making language forms from Ngubuyu typographically distinct. So we can locate them easily, we can put markup on them. And the dictionary is not that large, it's got around 4,000 entries in it. So, for a modern computer, this is nothing. We can actually search by brute force through the dictionary for any form we're interested in, and the computer will tell us if it's there or not. In any case, we need to break forms down into morphemes, which is what's going to be stored in the dictionary by and large. So this all needs to be done anyway. That can be done, also can be done automatically. And then the comparison with the dictionary can be done automatically. the links can be then generated automatically because we can have regular naming conventions for the files that we're going to put on the web, and we just need then to call links to those particular files, to particular anchors within them. So all of this is done automatically. And it's important to know that because our current estimate of the kind of amount of the total number of links that we're going to have when we have this entire description online in the form we'd like it to be in, there's going to be around 30,000 links between different items in the description. So, it's important that it can be done automatically. And it's important in terms of our broader aim of making it possible for people, if they have their data in certain forms, to get this kind of presentation easily. It needs to be automated. Okay, so we can do that for these lexical links. If you have sharp eyes, you would have noticed when I had those little extracts from Heath's work up on the screen that he uses a variety of typographical devices for orthography. He uses superscripts, particularly for the velar nasal and palatal nasal nga, and he uses some subscripts, and he uses underlines to indicate retroflex consonants. He uses colons for long vowels. That was the orthography that Heath developed. Between the time he published and today, the community, and this is a language which is relatively unusual in Australia, it's still being spoken, it's still being taught to children. The community have developed their own orthography, which is easier to deal with. And as I said at the start, one of our aims here is to make sure that people can view our result, the output that we're producing, can view it in either orthography. And again, this can be automated. The ways of writing Nungabuyu is very consistent. We can write a script that just goes through and provides the alternatives wherever we need them. Once we can identify the non-English forms, this is straightforward. We just go through and do a global replacement or global duplication of all where it's necessary. And then we can use that to produce two different outputs, and we can make sure that there are links which allow you to switch from one to the other. And I'll show you what that looks like at the end of the talk. Okay, so what else might there be that we're interested in doing that isn't in Heath at all? Although we can automate this process of making links into the dictionary, it's not completely straightforward. There are a couple of wrinkles there. One is that the spelling is not, Heath is not completely consistent, particularly in texts. So in texts, he transcribes a little bit closer to what he heard rather than to the kind of phonemic patterns that he put in the dictionary. Vowel length is one area where this gets a little bit variable. Also, the way he splits forms up using hyphens and equal signs is relevant because that's included in the dictionary. Forms have those in the dictionary if they can't stand on their own. So we need to have that information when we're searching the dictionary to make matches. And the way that we're doing that at the moment, and I haven't been able to think of a better way, so I think this is probably the way we're going to keep doing it, that we break forms that we're interested in down into morphemes, and then we generate candidates using various combinations of things like vowel lengths and hyphens and equal signs, and then search through the list of entries from the dictionary for all of those candidates, and then get rid of ones that we don't want, get rid of false positives. It's not perfect, but it seems to be working reasonably well, as you'll see when I get to showing you some of our current versions. Homonyms are always going to be a problem. Words that are spelt the same, but and sound the same and have different meanings. But it seems, at least for this language, there are not very many of them. So in the end, they'll probably just coded by hand, but it's not going to be an enormous task. Notice that in our long-term plan, this is not going to be so problematic. And that's generally true of what we're working on at the moment. Most of the problems we're dealing with come getting from what we have from Heath to what we want to be the input to producing our final presentation. So negotiating the difficulties of Heath's ways of writing things, that's not a problem that we would expect to be encountered for other people to encounter working in the future, because they will have underlying data that's much more reliable, much more consistent. So for example, if you've worked on your data with something like Toolbox, that means that the lexicon entries and the morphemes in interlinear text are going to correspond because the software enforces that. So that's the kind of input we anticipate that people will work with, and they'll get to that in a much more straightforward way than we have to working with Heath's legacy materials. Of course, homonyms can still be a problem there, but they're always going to be a problem. If someone can think of a good way to deal with them, that'll be nice, but at this point, we don't have to. Okay, so those are the kind of problems we deal with in trying to produce the underlying data that then we can put into a pipeline to get on the web. What is still missing that we're worried about? Well, one thing is media, links to media. And as I said, Heath provides a list of what's on what tape, but we want something much more precise than that. Ideally, we want to be able to link each unit in text to recording if it's available. And again, this is a problem of workflow. That's what people mostly do as an initial step in their workflow nowadays. You make a recording, you sit down, you chunk it into units, and you provide time codes for those units. We have to go back and retrofit that now. So someone has to sit down and go through the recordings and get time codes, which we can add to our text files, and then we can generate links from that automatically. In all of this, there's a little bit of a worry that we're still not quite sure how much audio we will be able to use. Heath's tapes were archived at the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra. We're negotiating with them. In principle, we can get access, but it's a slow process. And we have a little bit at the moment. We hope we'll be able to get quite a lot more. The other area where we're adding something which is not in Heath, links from a text to parts of the grammar which are exemplified by that text. So we've got the links from the grammar, which Heath made explicit, which said, go and look at this chunk of text to illustrate this point. We want to put links going the other way. So when you're looking at a unit of text, you can see that it was used to support certain points in the grammar. But this is also something that we can automate. And the way we're doing that is as we automatically create the links from the grammar to the texts. So as we process each of those numerical codes, we are adding an entry to a table which keeps track of those. So we're creating a link on the relevant grammar page that says go to this place in this file to see this example, but we're also writing a line into a table that says this this text unit exemplifies this section of the grammar, something in this section of the grammar. And when we've done all the links from the grammar to the texts, we've got that complete table, and then we can use that to put links into the texts that go back to the grammar. And again, I'll show you examples in a moment of how this all works. There is a small problem that we're still working on of how you're going to present this information, because there are cases where one unit in the text is referred to by many, many sections of the grammar, 5 or 6 or more. At the moment, we're just using a simple list. It may be that we could use some kind of pop-up menu when you roll over, but we're a little bit wary of that. In general, trying to keep as much of what we do to basic HTML as possible. We don't want to incorporate a lot of scripting if we can avoid it, just because it's hard to keep it sustainable and it is hard to maintain it over multiple platforms. Our philosophy is that the more we can do with basic HTML, the better, the more stable, the more sustainable the whole project will be. So, on the basis of kinds of considerations, what kind of stuff do we think should be encoded in an ideal grammar, in some format that's going to be the input to what we see as good presentation? Well, we want to see references to forms in the dictionary. We want to see references to texts. We want to see internal cross-references. Those are things that need to be encoded. And then there are a couple of things that we'd say you can build them when you need them. So one is links to media, which you're unlikely to use much in a grammatical description, but to the extent that you do want to use them, it will go via a unit of text or a dictionary entry. So if you have little audio clips in your dictionary to illustrate each word, you can access that rather than having to encode that directly into your grammar. The other thing that we say you can build when you need it is exhaustive listings of phenomena. So you have references to examples, but in many cases, you're not going to want to have a reference to every example, particularly if we're thinking about a common phenomenon. So if you think of a grammar of Indonesian, you do not want to have a reference presented to you automatically if you've got a reasonable sized body of text, you would not want every reference to the morpheme nya. It's too common. You'll want to see some representative examples in the first instance. You do want to see them all, but that's something that you should only do when you need it. It shouldn't be presented to you. So that's the idea we're saying here. Some things we will build as needed. They won't be encoded in the base data. In the text, what kind of things should be encoded? Well, references to media, very important, and references to dictionary entries. So for morphemes that are in the text, you should be able to go direct to the dictionary entries and get more information about them. And as I've been discussing, we're generating these back sections as we go, but ideally they should be part of what's encoded in text. And I'll come to why that's important in a moment. It's to do with the workflow. It's to do with how you actually would get to the point of description. In the dictionary, we want to see encoding of references to examples and cross-references within the dictionary, so references to the other forms in the dictionary, and references to media. As I said, good practice nowadays, you're going to have audio clips illustrating how we and so forth. As needed, and again, exhaustive listings of examples is one of them. Again, if you look at the dictionary, you're not going to want to be referred immediately to every instance of a common word. A representative sample, yes, and maybe in some circumstances, you'll want to see everything. Why are we worried about encoding back references from texts to grammatical points? Well, because we think that's actually how people work. Instead of writing a grammar and then putting the examples in, you actually look at texts, you make descriptive generalizations, and you take notes on what are good examples of that phenomenon. So in many cases, people will already be encoding that information in some kind of tagging, probably. We didn't have any choice about this because Heath had written the grammar and he'd included references to the examples he wanted to use. But as I've just tried to explain, the workflow, in fact, is the opposite direction. I would say that you find the examples which support the point that you're making. By looking at the examples, you come to the generalization. And this can be done in two ways, tracking these kind of phenomena through texts. One is that you can, which probably doesn't so much need explicit encoding, and that's where there's a characteristic morpheme involved. And the example I've put on screen is, say you've got instrumental case in a language. There's going to be a marker, maybe it has a couple of allomorphs, but they're identifiable. And you can find all the examples you need just by searching for that. But there are phenomena which don't have a characteristic lexical marker, and then you probably want to use tagging. So something like deixis, where you have multiple lexical items involved, multiple different kinds of phenomena, multiple different aspects of the one phenomenon, and then good practice is going to be, as you're going through texts with each unit, if it's relevant, you're going to say, tag it as being an example of deixis. And then you can recover the information easily in order to make the kind of links that we think are useful. And the tagging then can be encoded in your text data. Okay, I think I'm almost at the point where I can show you what some of this looks like. So before I do that, just to summarize a couple of the main points here. What we're looking at here is how to show the interlinking, the essentially interlinked nature of material produced in language documentation and language description, and how to exploit that to make it more accessible, more usable. We've based, at least as a starting point, how that can work on what Heath had done. He had this conceptualized, but didn't have a good technological solution. So we've started by trying to have a better technological implementation of what Heath did, and then to make some extensions to that. And what we're doing essentially, very importantly, shows that the way to do this is to work from content. Having well-formatted, explicitly described content means you can do this automatically. You don't have to do it all manually. Once you've got the data into the right kind of formats, and they're not that complex, once you've got them into those formats, then essentially you're just running scripts over the data and producing this really rich environment in which you can work with the materials. So a message here is that for people working with language data, building good content is really important. Knowing what kind of things should be made explicit, knowing what are good formats, this is all really, really important if you want to be able to take advantage of the kind of possibilities that we've been investigating. Okay, I think that's the end of my slides. Oh no, yeah, and we can have different modes of presentation. I'll illustrate that for you in a moment. Okay, so now I'm going to, I hope, how long, I've spoken for a long time already, I'm afraid, Gede. Is it okay if I take a few more minutes just to look at the to
Yeah.
demonstrate a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's have a look at what we've actually got. We want to go over here. Okay. So here's the moment. We have very low design values. This is a very basic landing page for what we're doing. Let me give you an indication of the kind of stuff we're doing here. I'm going to go, I'm going to go first into the grammar. Okay, so here's a page from the grammar, a section from the grammar. We have links to the original text scanned, if anybody wants to look at that, because why not? It's very easy to do that today. You can see that within this page there are links to different things. These are links to phonological rules. So this is a different format, that's an older version. There are links to words in the dictionary. And importantly, there are links to other sections in the grammar. I'm not even going to click on that because I know that doesn't exist yet, but it was automatically generated in the process of producing this page. But most importantly, we've got links to examples. So here, this is a section on reduplication for nouns, and it talks about the word foot and says there's one example of a particular reduplicative pattern for it, and it's in text 163, line 4. So here we are in text 163, line 4, and here's the relevant example, the reduplicated form. We can go and visit that word in the dictionary if we wanted to. No, that's a false positive from our matching. Damn it. Now, I carefully chose this example because this is the one text where we currently have audio linked, so we can hear this example. Okay. We have the basic listing of sections in the grammar which refer to this example. So there are 3 different ones. Again, only one of them is one that we can visit. We'll go back to where we came from. Let's have a look at some other examples of linking. We'll go to this word in the dictionary. And again, you can see there's lots of links. Again, these are all generated automatically. So all these links to different text examples automatically generated. This one should work. Yep, that's text 18. And it's one of the grass words. It's exemplified there, I think. The backlink didn't work well. There are links to other words in the dictionary. So rangag, treated as an opposite. Here it's contrasted with mada, which we came from. We can go back there. More text examples and so forth. So all of this is linked. All of these different aspects of the description and the documentation are linked, and you can move between them without having to juggle 3 large printed volumes. Everything is there just to click on. Now, the last 2 things I'll show you quickly. First, I mentioned the orthography problem. So here's, again, this is a single example we have set up at the moment, but it gives you the idea of how this works. So this is a page which uses Heath's orthography. We've got the superscript G there. We've got some subscripts. Do we have a long vowel? Yes, we've got a long vowel in there. And we can switch. So here's the same thing. Instead of having the subscript G, it's just written as NG. Long vowel is written with a doubled vowel. The subscript disappears because it actually doesn't matter very much. So this is what we will have possible throughout the entire description. On any given page, you'll be able to switch to the different orthography. Once you're into one orthography, all the links will keep you in the same orthographic universe, but you can switch to the other one whenever you want to. And the other thing I'll just quickly show you is, as I said, once you have the data in explicitly organised forms, you can do different things with it. So the grammar proper, what we're working with here is markup based on the text encoding initiative principles. And text encoding initiative allows you access to tools like this one called TEI Publisher. And here's a page from the grammar as it's presented by TEI Publisher using the same underlying data. So again, we've got links to page scans, we've got internal links, although I'm not sure that they work very well. But, you know, moves on between one page and the next, and so forth. And also, importantly, this is printable. You can export this to a PDF. So you have multiple presentation possibilities that come from having the data in the right kind of formats. Okay, I think I've spoken for long enough. I'll stop there.
Okay, it's very interesting presentation and also useful, I think, for everyone doing language documentation. And now I will present the question for you, Simon. So here it is. Maybe I will stop your sharing, content sharing, and I will light up my screen. Hopefully you see a question here. You see, Simon?
Yeah. Okay, so the first question here, I should make it clear that I have not directly done any work on Nungabuyu. We're working with Heath's materials. We have some collaboration and input from another colleague at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Brett Baker, who has worked directly with Nungabuyu people. But in terms of actual documentation work, I haven't. I'm sad to say I haven't touched Nungabuyu. I'm relying on other people's work. So the data, yes, it is from Heath. We haven't used any of Brett's data at this stage.
Okay. Still from Ibu Poppy. And we have after this.
There are, from memory, around 120 or 150 speakers of Nungabuyu. And it's, yes, the language is being transmitted to children. It's not a revival project, it's a maintenance project. The language is being used consistently and people are working to make sure that it continues to be used, but its use hasn't declined to the point where they're thinking about it as revival. They're just thinking about it as, let's keep this going.
Okay, sorry. Now, is that done, Simon?
Yeah.
Okay, so, I just need to put on another question. So here it is.
Question from Pakwayan.
Just so you have easier look.
Okay. This is an interesting question. So I think that an answer to this was implicit in some of the things I talked about. When I talked about being able to access exhaustive listings of phenomena if one was interested in doing so, that implies that at some point we would see search capabilities as part of a full system that we'd want to work with. And I think that gets towards the kind of idea you have here, Wayan, that you might need to look at stuff that's not just examples. Yes, statistical patterns might be interesting, and yes, then what you can search for becomes important, and that will depend on what's tagged in the underlying data. Over the last few years, when we've presented versions of this work, one of the questions that people ask is, well, what should I be doing now in order to make my data usable in this way? And one of the answers we give to that question is, when you're working with texts, tag stuff. Use lots of tags, even if you think it's too many. Yeah, I think there's a kind of an answer to the question there. I mean, it's notoriously difficult to predict in advance everything that people might want to search for. That's a big problem in designing any kind of search engine. How many possibilities are you going to allow without making the system become unmanageable? So one answer is we hope we provide enough capability to do the kinds of searching, the kinds of exploration that you are interested in here, but it might not always work.
Okay, maybe I will continue first the question on the chat before I let people ask directly. Here for me to read this. So, is language documentation only applied for the language scarcely used or almost extinct? It's from Ibu Eli.
Okay. As a subfield in linguistics, language documentation was a response to the problem of language endangerment. And that's partly because, well, it's a resource allocation question. So the part of the motivation here is that doing the kind of analytic work that ends up with a published description is very time consuming, and the rate at which languages are ceasing to be spoken is such that we probably don't have time for that. It's the luxury that we can't afford. And so the idea that we should just collect a lot of data in a reasonably structured way as a first step was the motivating impulse for language documentation as a subfield. And it's still very important. Now, in the nature of things, more widely used languages are, at least to some extent, self-documenting. So a language like Bahasa Indonesia has a huge amount of published material, which represents at least certain registers. There's huge amounts of recorded material or potentially recordable material produced every day in TV broadcasts, radio broadcasts, blogs, vlogs, whatever. There's huge amounts of material available for such languages. But it's important to notice that the concept of documentation is, I think, still relevant for major languages. And the reason was in something that I just said when I said, there's a huge amount of published material in Bahasa Indonesia, but it represents certain registers and certain genres. And to know a lot about a language, we want to know about lots of different registers and lots of different genres. And some registers just don't get recorded because they're stigmatized or because nobody really notices they're even happening. And so from that point of view, I think documentation does apply to languages other than ones that are in danger of stopping being spoken. There are aspects of every language which are less valued, more likely to disappear, and worth preserving in some form, worth having a record of in some form.
Okay. So maybe any comments from maybe Bu Poppy who asked question, or Pak Wayan or Bu Eli about the response from Simon?
Oh yeah, I just add a new question. Thank you very much for this presentation. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you, maybe you have said, but I kind of missed it, whether you also do the link between the words, so the orthography and the audio, because it would be very useful, I think, to hear how each word is pronounced, because sometimes if you have this very long Australian language, word in Australian language, very difficult to imagine how it sounds.
We don't have that at the moment, and to do it would depend on someone, again, going through the audio and hand coding each word. And again, that's, at least in some cases, that's part of people's workflow nowadays. So people do quite regularly record time codes in using a software like ELAN for individual words. And that, even some of that nowadays can be automated. You can use forced alignment software to get some of that done for you. And once you have the time codes, then it's straightforward to make those kinds of links. For the material we're working with, it would be quite tedious, and we haven't planned to go to that length at the moment.
Okay, I think Pak Wayan wants to say something. Go ahead.
Thanks, Simon. This is interesting, and a lot of interesting points. I just want to get your comments. So it's interesting that you have this idea of quartet extending Boasian trilogy. Okay. But it seems to me that the notion of text that you think about is in a narrow kind of idea. But if you think of Haladian's a notion of text, where text is not simply written, it's not only simply written, but also context and other things included. So the idea of media in modern technology provides actually, more information, within this notion of text. So it should be perhaps media is part of the first, part of Boasian trilogy. So text and media, okay, or context, whatever, because media is just, this medium element, right? So the question is, do you really need an extra separate element within this concept? So what do you think?
I think that the interesting way to answer this question would be to try and produce a web presentation of a sign language, because then there's no question that the media would have to be primary, because we're all so accustomed to the correspondence of sound and symbols on a page. We, as you're indicating, we gloss over a huge amount of important information. We just kind of ignore it because we're so used to saying, oh yeah, that's the language written down. Trying to do the same kind of thing that we're trying to do for Heath, trying to do that for a sign language would raise these problems in a very acute form. And I think it would be enormously challenging and enormously instructive. And if you could do it in any way that worked at all, feeding what you learn from that back into working with spoken language would be a very valuable exercise. Not volunteering for the task. Dealing with Heath has already taken a number of years of my life, and I'm not sure that I want to expand the problems any further.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay.
But I think the other issue there is that for a lot of the material we might want to work with, we won't necessarily have the gesture and facial expression information. So you can't really do much in that case. But in principle, I completely agree with you.
Okay.
All right. We still have 6 minutes. I don't know if anyone wants to ask another question or not. So I have a quick one, Simon. So do you think this idea, this is, I think, brilliant idea. And do you think the format of how people document language nowadays would allow you to do the same like what you are doing at the moment, presenting all of those grammatical description in the web with those links?
It should be much easier. If people are working with well-formatted data, explicit data structures, using tools like Toolbox and ELAN, where a whole lot of the information that we want to work with is being built into your workflow, it should be possible and it should be relatively straightforward.
Okay.
As I said, most of the problems we've had to deal with are getting from what Heath published, the format that we see is actually the starting point for this process.
Yeah. Okay. We still have 5 minutes. If there is any question from anyone, any comment from anyone, you are welcome.
Can I have another question?
Yeah,
This is probably this is not relevant to your presentation, but I'm quite interested in how the Nungbuyu people maintain their language. You said that it's 150 speakers. It's a very highly endangered language, I suppose. Yeah. But do they like live isolated from the dominant Australian English speakers, or do you know how they? I mean, how do they maintain this this language?
Okay, I don't know exactly. My best guess would be, firstly, that they are a what's the word? A cohesive community, and that they probably are not isolated, but do see themselves as distinct from the mainstream Australian community, and therefore are very comfortable to continue using their language. I mean, obviously they'll all be multilingual. They'll all also use varieties of English, Creole, and probably other Indigenous languages as well. But they've, even with that size group, they've managed to maintain a tradition of using their language. But as I say, I don't know the exact details. Brett Baker is the person I would have to consult on that.
Okay, thank you. So this is still 3 minutes and 2 minutes now. So I think let's call it a day, and it's already also quite near the evening in Australia. So thank you for everyone, the participants, lecturers, and also professors who attended this session and spent their time to hear this presentation, and also for the question and also the comments. So we will have the last session for this year on the Mother's Day, 22nd of December. Going back home for speaker from our department by Professor Sudipa. So I hope could attend and spend time for that session on the 22nd of December. And I again thank you, Simon, for your great presentation, for your time, and for sharing with us this brilliant idea. So with that, I would like to close this session. Have a good day. Stay healthy and safe. See you around next time. Bye-bye.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simon.